So what does this mean? We're hearing 70% in terms of troops. That's how many numbers Russia have called up required for an invasion. Are we building towards the numbers are looking inevitable?
Thanks so much for having me, Tom. And I have to say, it's an honor to follow my home state senator from Maryland, Senator Cardin there. Nice to hear my Maryland accent, before me there. What he said was absolutely true. There's a united Democrat and Republican front on this, which you don't see very often. That the U.S. should not commit troops to actually support the defense of Ukraine at this time, but there would be a united front against Vladimir Putin and the economy of Russia via sanctions, if that's the case. When you talk about this 70% number, I would actually hold off on any kind of reading those numbers as to what that really means, because so much now can be done remotely. Whether it's through non-kinetic like cyberspace activity or, through launches outside the borders in order for defense or offense. So the number of troops for any given like that is a really intense calculation that actually wouldn't put to mind. What it does say is that the number of troops on the border and where U.S. troops are within NATO countries, it really is part of the deterrent and diplomatic playing field for leverage. Clearly, Russia is showing a very strong, presence. And the U.S. is showing a strong, discussion of bipartisan Democratic and Republican activity for sanctions against Russia. So those are the driving things to pay attention to, those potential numbers, I think, Tom.
Right. So when you talk about leverage and a lot of the commentary that perhaps China would be angry if Russia launched action during the Winter Olympic Games, what do we make of this communique being sent out between the two nations right as the opening ceremony started, a very provocative one about the global security situation and basically China backing in Russian action?
Yes, I mean, both of them have a common enemy, right? Not just the United States, but all of the United States and allies like Australia that continuously talk about trying to support the free and open trade in the Indo-Pacific and elsewhere, the rules-based order, trying to support the World Trade Organization and rules between countries. China and Russia both have a united front against those things. And Russia, of course, facing crippling sanctions if they actually did invade Ukraine, wants to have an economy like China's. Remember, Russia's GDP is 1.4 trillion, about the size of Australia's. China's is 14 trillion, so literally 10 times the size. And just in the past year, Russia-China trade increased by 33%. So you see that they have a lot of reason to come together to try to fortify themselves against the U.S. and other influences around the world.
So, you mentioned Russia. It needs China because its economy is still only the size of Spain, so it hasn't become the behemoth it should have economically. But this statement between China and Russia, it's got a lot of headlines. Yes, there's specific talk of Taiwan and Ukraine, but is the worry it goes further, that this is a broad sort of expansionist commentary, or is that
It is.
Is that overreading it?
No, Tom, it is. I mean, it's a 5,400-word statement that I read, and a few highlights. It really calls out its own interpretation of the global order. It actually calls out democracy and basically says that democracies around the world, like the United States, are democracies in name only. And states, I think even one of my most interesting lines was, "We stand ready to support genuine democracy around the world," and stating that democracies like the United States really don't support democratic values in their international relations by the way that they, to use China and Russia's words, interfere with other nations' sovereign activity. So that's just one example of many lines that were in there that give their own interpretation of the world order. And what you'll see in statements from the U.S. and Australian allies in the coming months, I believe, will really look at that narrative that Russia and China put together in this statement that came out this week. Really worth a read, because it does go much beyond things like it's vilifying the AUKUS pact and talking about the United States and its allies as not being supportive of global security.
Yeah, and even talking about the Russian and Chinese interpretation of democracy, which is, it feels somewhat Orwellian. I just want to finish as well on the talk within this agreement of the UN. And some people might say, well, that's great that they're talking about the UN and this is the correct body to sort out these sorts of tensions. But this comes back to the Russian and Chinese veto votes, that they can gum up the UN and make it irrelevant in a lot of these situations.
They can certainly gum up the UN, but they also know who their audiences are. When they talk about trying to support the United Nations, first of all, both Russia and China, and particularly China, is trying to work to develop more influence within the bureaucracy of the United Nations to have more influence. We saw that with the World Health Organization during the COVID pandemic. But also, they know their audiences. They talk about in the statement. They have several paragraphs devoted to the importance of development and the importance to helping developing countries get to the next level with development. Whereas they have a very different theory on how to do that, right? China, we know, uses a more bilateral approach with using its own projects, contracts, workers in order to create development projects within countries, providing loans, providing grants that might have a diplomatic effect as well in those countries compared to what the United States and allies might do for development. So just simply saying that development is important and the United Nations is important speaks to a certain audience, but you have to read the sort of fine print or between the lines.